Ontario Regional Chief Day's in the studio here at Net News Ledger. I'm James, and we're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation, where the recommendations have come down, the report's coming. Chief Day, what needs to happen for action right now?
Well, first of all, James, I want to take the time here to commend Justice Murray Sinclair, now Senator Sinclair, and his other commissioners that were part of that important team. We often now in this day in the process are looking at the 94 calls for action, and we're looking at the future, and we're talking to governments quite a bit about these things. But we cannot forget that it was the survivors and those that went to residential schools that actually built that Truth and Reconciliation Commission work, and it was the survivors that actually did the work to come up with the 94 calls for action. The senator and his team of commissioners simply designed and engineered a process. Let's not forget the survivors that did the work, and we owe a debt of gratitude to them. Now, on the 94 calls for action, it's really important at this time that we look at what's happened in our communities over the last several decades and a century and a half of essentially torture under colonial control. And where we're finally at, I take two things that are important to this discussion. One being the 94 calls for action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. These two very important processes are 20 years apart. And one of the things that I'd like to put out there just for thought and dialogue among our First Nation leadership is this: that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talks about what happened to our people as a result of colonialism and what happened to our children when they were yanked and torn from their families and their communities, the social issues and the impacts of that incursion on our people. Then you talk about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People that actually talked about our communities and self-government. So on this hand, we talk about the Indian Residential School. On this hand, we talk about the Indian Act system. And I think where we're finally at, James, is we're at a point in time where we are now going to be able to take the Indian Act piece and the Indian Residential School piece, and those two things combined, looking at control of lands and looking at new governance models and respect for First Nations authority, and taking time to do the social mending and healing in our communities with our young people, with our elders, with those that suffered multi-generational impacts of abuse from the residential schools. Those two things combined, if we strategically go forward as First Nation people in Ontario and across the country, I really believe that we will do the things necessary for the next generation so that our young people have something to work with. So, as I look at the TRC and the 94 calls for action, I not only look at what the 94 calls for action in the TRC are doing here, but I also go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Those two things combined are really the guideposts for a pretty solid path and a straight target towards not just healing the people, but finally bringing our communities and securing our rightful place in this country.
Chief Day, thank you much. From the heart of Turtle Island, I'm James with Net News Ledger.
Thank you.